the Sarcastic school teacher. So I thought I'd start to do something a bit different. I have approximately 1 billion PowerPoints. That's hyperbole. And I thought, well, I could use these. Why not share the glory of the PowerPoints and make some videos at the same time? So here we are. This is going to be me, my voice, not my face. No. Talking over some of my PowerPoints. So welcome. So today's video is on Macbeth. This video will work if you have already studied Macbeth and you want to do some revision, or if you're just starting out on what is an amazing, dramatic, and very violent play. So today we're going to start with the context. This is what we're going to start with, the context. And context may or may not be a word you're familiar with. Before we start, little spoiler alert. Yeah, there will be some spoilers in this video. Kind of hard to talk about the play without talking about people who die. Spoiler alert, people die. So if you want to read the play in your own time and not find out which people die, you maybe don't want to watch this video. Don't watch it and then cry and sue me because I ruined the end. Okay, here we go. So we're going to do the context of Macbeth. First thing we have to talk about is, what does context mean? What does this word mean? So have a little think. The thing about these videos is it's not just stare mindlessly at the screen and listen to my dulcet tones and scroll Snapchat at the same time. You've got to be a little bit participatory. It's a bit interactive. So if I ask a question, it isn't just a rhetorical question. Have a think in your head. What does it mean? What do you think context means? What does context mean? It is something you will have to write about whenever you do literature, poetry, plays, novels. It's quite important that you are able to understand and write about the context. And the context, it means what life and society were like when a text was written. What era was it written in? What were the social norms? What were the beliefs? What were the behaviours? And how does this influence the text and our understanding of it? So when did Shakespeare write Macbeth? In terms of our understanding of the play, we have to know when he wrote it. When did he write this play? Approximately. Do you know? Have a guess. Which century? So he wrote it in approximately 1606. We don't know exactly when, but it was in the early 1600s. That's when he wrote this play. Okay, next step. So what era? What do we call this era? If you've done Christmas Carol, it's the Victorian era. If you've done Inspector Calls, it's the Edwardian era. So what era was Macbeth written in? We talk about the context. And we call it the Jacobean era. Looks like Jacobin, but it's pronounced the Jacobean era. And that was because King James was on the throne. Here he is. Look how stylish he looks. I love that hat. So here he is, King James. He was on the throne at the time, so we call it the Jacobean era. Okay, next. So now what we need to talk about is Shakespeare and Macbeth, the play, and the Jacobean era. What is the context of this play? What do people believe in the Jacobean era, and how does it help us understand the play? And some of the things we're going to talk about are the supernatural. Ooh, it's a very supernatural, spooky play. Kings. It's a play about kings. Kings being murdered. People becoming king. People being good kings. People being bad kings. People's belief about kings is vital to our understanding of this play. And men and women. What did society believe about men and women and their behaviour and how they were meant to behave? And something called the natural order. This is also something the Jacobeans believed in that we will be explaining later on in the video. Okay, are you ready? Okay, good. Let's go. First thing, supernatural. Oh, not first thing. The first thing is actually to remind you that you're not writing a history essay. This is quite important. English literature is not about churning out dates, historical facts, etc. It might be really tempting to look up loads of stuff about the era, about King James, what he was into. He was really fascinated by witches, etc. Might be really tempting to give us a history lecture. His favourite sandwich, was it peanut butter and jam? Yeah, but don't do this, because what we have to do is weave in the context. We have to explain how it's relevant. How does it expand our understanding of the text? See, Loki says, no, do not give us a history essay. It's not about lots of dates and facts. It's about how we weave it in and make it relevant. Okay, so now we do the supernatural. Spooky skeletons and lovely ghosts. So this is going to be the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of the context of the play. Maybe you know something about the supernatural. Have a think about, what does this word mean to you, the supernatural? What does it mean? What things do you associate with it? And what do we think they thought of the supernatural in the Jacobean era, in Shakespeare's time? So, belief in the supernatural, it was far more prevalent in the Jacobean era. And Shakespeare's audience, they were far more likely than audiences today to believe in things like ghosts and witches and demons and generally all things spooky. Some people today will believe in things like ghosts, etc., and that's fine. I personally don't. But a lot of people today have kind of rejected these ideas, think of them as being superstitious, but in Shakespeare's time, far more people believed in these things as being real. And there are witches in this play. There is a scene in which there is something that seems like it might be a ghost, and Shakespeare's audience would have been far more likely to believe in these things as being very real. And what's quite important, again, is we've always got to bring the context around to being relevant. How is it actually relevant to the play? This historical context, this historical belief in the supernatural, the fear of things like witches. How is it relevant? Well, there are 3 witches, and they feature really prominently in the play. These are the first characters we see. And Shakespeare's audience would have been highly likely to believe in witches, to see them as real evil entities. They would have believed in supernatural prophecies. There are prophecies in the play. And they would have been more likely to believe in things like black magic. And Macbeth, our main character, our main man, he becomes quite obsessed with these witches. They give him prophecies. These prophecies come true and he grows to depend on them. And the audience would have been really horrified at this. Our main character, he becomes the king. Spoiler alert, they would have been really horrified that the king would associate with such horrifying, dark, supernatural forces. And Lady Macbeth, his wife, she becomes the queen. At the start of the play, she calls upon evil spirits. She says, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts." Now, we today are more likely to not believe in these spirits and think, well, she's calling on evil spirits, but they're not actually going to come and, possess her or aid her in her quest for glory and power. But the Shakespearean audience would have been far more likely to believe that such demonic forces were real and that she really was truly calling upon these spirits that tend on mortal thoughts. The fact that Shakespeare associates Macbeth and Lady Macbeth with the supernatural, with witches, with spirits, would probably have made his audience see these 2 characters like inextricably linked with evil, with darkness. Okay, next. Next up is kings. Kings in the Jacobean era. Now, we still have kings and queens in this country, and we have done for thousands of years. We have Queen Elizabeth. But really nowadays, they're a figurehead. Queen, I think she goes out, wears nice hats, she cuts some ribbons on new hospitals. She gets given flowers by cute little kiddies, etc. But she's really just a figurehead now. She doesn't have any real power. But in the Jacobean era, the king was the main man. He had the power. He made the laws. He had the power of life and death over people. Kings were very, very important. And this is a play very much about kings, kingship, leadership, what it means to be a king, what makes a good king, what makes a bad king. And this play is an exploration of kingship, really. So it's very important that we understand what people thought about kings in the Jacobean era. And quite importantly, they believed that kings were chosen by God. The king, wasn't democratically elected, etc. He was God's chosen one. He was God's representation on earth. And this was called the divine right of kings. And this is very important, this phrase, you need to remember it, the divine right of kings. They truly believed in this. So kings were not just mere mortals, they were divine beings. They were inextricably linked with the land. They were the land, they were the country, they were God's own chosen one. They were divine beings. So, murdering one was kind of a big deal. If you think about how much of a big deal it is today, the thought of someone, killing the king or queen, times that by a gazillion, and you've got what Shakespeare's audience would have believed about this play, about the murder of the king, God's chosen one. So how is this relevant to Macbeth? Well, here's a massive spoiler, as I warned you earlier. Macbeth, who's a thane, he's a lord, and he wants to be king. He murders the king, King Duncan, so that he can be the king. Whoop, whoop, spoiler. Sorry about that. Sorry, not sorry. So Macbeth has therefore not only committed murder, treason, in the eyes of the Jacobean audience, he's killed God's chosen one. He's attacked God in a way. So the Jacobean audience would have absolutely seen this as the ultimate act of heresy and horror. They would have been utterly appalled by this and fully expected there to be terrible consequences. And there are. So on the night of Duncan's murder, early on in the play, Macbeth, stabby, stabs Duncan to death so he can become king. But on this night, there are characters who describe these terrible, unnatural events that take place the night of Duncan's murder. There's an earthquake. Scotland, with generally not many earthquakes happening in Scotland, there's an earthquake. Tiny little birds are devouring huge birds. The sun doesn't shine. It's dark, middle of the day, but the sun doesn't shine. And horses eat each other. So a whole bunch of terrible stuff happens the night that Duncan is murdered. Earthquakes, darkness, horses chomping on each other. So it's quite important that we understand why this poor horse, dude, what are you doing? Why this poor horse is eaten by another horse? Why is there darkness in the middle of the day? Why is there an earthquake, etc.? Why? We think these violent and terrifying and unnatural events occur when Duncan is killed. What is Shakespeare trying to show us in the play by having these things happen when the king is murdered? And the key word here is unnatural. These terrible unnatural events happen because of what has occurred. The very earth itself is affected. And we could say that Shakespeare is suggesting that the murder of a king, who's God's chosen one, is so hideous, so devastating that the repercussions are awful. The very land itself is shaking from an earthquake because the king has been murdered. Perhaps the Jacobean audience would have believed that these events were punishments from God. Or perhaps they would have seen it as a consequence of such an act which transgresses the very laws of nature. This isn't just a human being who's been murdered in their eyes. The king has been murdered, and therefore the entire nation, the very land, would be shaking in horror at such an act. Whoa. Moving on. Now we're going to talk about men and women, how they're portrayed in the play, and what the Jacobean audience thought of men and women, what their expectations were. And you may be wondering why I've put up these two GIFs. If you pronounce it GIF wrong, surely it's GIF. We've got this man here, he's being all strong. And then we've got the woman here being all nurturing. She's the mum. You might be thinking, this is pretty stereotypical. And you'd be right. Because in the Jacobean era, when Shakespeare was writing this play, they had very rigid views about men and women and their behaviour. Men were seen to be naturally superior, and women were deemed to just be naturally inferior. This is what they thought was the way of things. Men were expected to be leaders, they were meant to be strong, they were the decision makers, and women were expected to be gentle and obedient and nurturing. Their primary roles were wife and mother. So they had very stereotypical, very traditional, quite rigid views about how men and women were meant to behave. I can tell you that if I had lived then, this is what would have happened to me. She's a witch! But luckily I live now in the 21st century, so I'm not being dragged off to the stake. So, how is this relevant to Macbeth? These very rigid views about men and women and their behaviour. How is this relevant? Well, it's very important, these notions of masculinity and femininity, which today most of us understand to be social constructs. Masculinity, strength, bravery; femininity, kind and gentle and nurturing. We understand these are things we've made up. They're just social constructs. But in the Jacobean society, this was fact. This was the natural law. I mean, Macbeth, in many ways, to the Jacobean audience, he'd be seen as such a man. He's really ruthless. He's quite savage on the battlefield, and he really is praised for this. Violence is quite glorified in many ways in the play. Men being violent at the beginning of the play, the men are like, yeah, bro, well done. And then this whole notion of masculinity. Lady Macbeth, the way she manages to manipulate him is she attacks his masculinity. She suggests that if he refuses to murder Duncan, then he's not enough of a man. So basically, this is just ultimately one of Macbeth's weaknesses, is that he just can't handle being called a wuss. Don't use the word wuss in your essays. That will not be formal enough, but it's okay for me to talk about it. So the whole idea of he wants to conform to this very rigid view of being a man, and ultimately that ends up ironically being a weakness. And also Lady Macbeth, she's ambitious. She is strong. She's ambitious. She's manipulative. She's dominant. At the beginning of the play, she's kind of a bit of a badass, really. So many of the audience might have been quite shocked at this, because she's in many ways the opposite of an ideal Jacobean woman. She counters her husband, she argues with him, she manipulates him, she's very dominant over him, and she's very ambitious, and women were not meant to be ambitious. They were meant to want to be good and sweet and kind and obedient, and to do some housework and do the dishes and raise their children. That was it. Luckily today, things are different. Back then, though, they would have seen this as pretty horrifying and appalling that she behaves in this way. So last but not least, and some of the things that we've been talking about are linked in with this, e.g. what they believed about men and women and kings. The Jacobean audience believed in something called the natural order. And you might sometimes, again, hear this called the Great Chain of Being, but I'm going to talk about it called the natural order. And this was their belief in the hierarchy of importance. They believed that everything had its preordained place in the universe. Everything had its place, and everything had to stay in that particular place and behave in the preordained way, or they thought there would be repercussions. Let's imagine it like a pyramid. Okay, let's imagine like a pyramid. Some things are near the top of the pyramid, and some things they thought should naturally be at the bottom. So who do we think was at the top? Who did they think would naturally be at the top? And it was, of course, God. God, this is from the Sistine Chapel. I have seen this in Rome. It's beautiful. This is Michelangelo's painting of God. Just a bit of art history there for you. So next. What's next? Who's up next? Who do they think was then below? In terms of things that we need to talk about in the play, who's next? And it's the king. The king is naturally then, he's above everyone. He's above all other, just below God. He's below God and above all other human beings. So then who's next? Then we have the nobles, lords, ladies in the play. There's thanes. Macbeth is a thane. These were then seen, to be next. And we've got peasants, farmers, etc. Peasants, as you can see, they're having a really great time being really poor and exploited. They were seen as naturally inferior. They were at the bottom of the pyramid. And they also believed that men were naturally superior to women. They were meant to be dominant. They were the head of the household, etc. So they had very clear views about this thing called the natural order. As we know, in the play, not everyone and everything goes according to the natural order. Lady Macbeth is very dominant. She exerts power over her husband. So the Jacobean audience would have thought that she was transgressing, this natural order. They'd be like, oh, no, this is bad. This is going to cause, bad things to happen. And it does. Macbeth, he murders the rightful king and then becomes the king. And the audience would have thought, no, wait, the wrong person is the king now. Everything's topsy-turvy. So many things happen in the play that do not conform to the natural order. And this would have been deemed to be very dangerous. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear. Yes. Fucking, lots of screaming. Oh my goodness. Natural order horribly violated. So, what did they think would happen if the natural order was disrupted? As you can see, I've had a lot of fun with animations. So what would they have believed? They obviously would have believed that this would have been a violation. And they would have believed that there would have been terrible repercussions in the play. And we do see these repercussions. There is an earthquake, as we've talked about before. There is terrible darkness that occurs when it's meant to be daytime. Horses are eating each other. And we also have ghosts, supernatural entities haunting others. Or is it a hallucination? I'll leave that up to you when you read the play. And also characters going insane. We have many, many repercussions of this violation of the natural order. And Shakespeare is clearly writing this play to show that if you transgress these natural laws, then there will be terrible consequences. And whether he truly believed this or not is up to you, because he writes lots of plays with strong women. And I think he did admire strong women, but on the other hand, he was writing to please his audience, and he was writing to please the king. We always have to remember this. So, amazing. We've learned loads. What you should do now is give yourself a little test. You should test yourself, maybe write the answers down, and then go back through this video and see if you got it right. The thing about learning is you've always got to revisit it, learn something, and then test yourself. Get a blank piece of paper and write down the answers. See if you can remember it. What era was Macbeth written in? You should answer these questions. You should answer them right now, and then you should go back through the video. I'm not going to answer them for you. I want to go and get a cup of coffee. Thanks very much. Maybe even a biscuit. What era was Macbeth written in? Write it down. What did that particular society believe about the supernatural? Write it in your own words. The important thing about learning is I teach you something, and then you have to try to recall that information. It's always good to write it in your own words. What did that particular society believe about kings? What was that phrase we learned, a particularly important phrase? What did that society believe about men and women? What were their rigid views? And they believed in something called the natural order. What was that? How would you write it in your own words? Well done. I'm impressed with you today. If you've got any questions, you can always drop them in the comments. You should go back through the video, see if you can answer these questions. So congrats, you did it. You've learned a bunch of stuff about Macbeth in context. So don't forget to subscribe. More videos coming soon. And a big well done. I'm impressed with you. I'm impressed with me. We should all give ourselves a round of applause. Yay! Well done.